Welcome to Creating Better Products, where we explore the journeys of product leaders and practitioners on their way to creating extraordinary products. Join us as our guests share their real world experiences, not just the triumphs, which are great, of course, but also the challenges and lessons learned along the way. And even better, get actionable takeaways that you can apply tomorrow. I'm your host, Sabrina Mach. I have almost 2 decades of experience in design and product, but beyond my own experience, I love learning from others. But I also know that it can be hard for individuals, including myself, to capture the unique and valuable experience that we have. So, this is why my mission is to share the untold stories of amazing product and design professionals with you and the world, so that we can learn from each other together. Today, I have my guest, Larissa Günther. And she is an amazing person. She is a product engineer at Thoughtworks, where she consults mostly automotive clients. But what I really love about Larissa's story is that her journey started as a web and graphic designer. And then, Larissa, I think 5 years ago, you made the transition to software engineer and are now in this role. And I believe you're based in Munich, Germany. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm even more excited because we will speak about accessibility today. And I believe you've become a champion for this topic and have been working with clients in different kinds of engagements. And I'm really curious to hear, how did you first get into this topic?
So yeah, I actually got across this article a few years ago, which basically just stated 97% of the internet is not accessible to people with disabilities, which I couldn't really believe at first because it's just an insane number. And then I kind of like looked into it, and turns out the number is actually true. And I also started then to learn how to create a website in a way that would be accessible for different needs. And while I got into this, I think that was really fascinating because actually, like, the web is built upon tools and technologies that are accessible by default when you use them properly. So in the end, I feel what that means is, like, contrary to like us individuals in the real world where we often cannot like change or influence things so much, in a digital world we as technologists have the complete control and power over creating this accessible to everyone web that I would really like to use in the future. Yeah, and that like kind of still fascinates me and got me onto my mission.
Wow, it does sound like an empowered journey, realizing you can make a change. And today we're going to talk about you actually helping organizations making that change. And I'm aware, Larissa, that you recently worked with an automotive client on implementing accessibility at scale. And when I say scale, it's quite impressive because in the context you operated in, there were 26 different teams with different shapes and makeups, and some of them were from the client, and sometimes they were also from other vendors working with the client. So actually, the environment you worked in was not just at scale, but also in a complex environment. So I think we have a juicy story ahead of us, and I'm really curious. How did that journey start? How did you first convince the client that they should invest in accessibility, especially as the product or the suite of products you're working on was for internal use for employees?
Yeah, I wish I could say it was an easy start, but unfortunately it wasn't. So, as you said, like, we had a really complex environment, and also the project was not necessarily in the best state regarding timelines. So, they were under a lot of delivery pressure. A lot of teams were already behind delivery timelines. So, it wasn't exactly like the time you would just go into and say, like, hey, I know you're already late with your work, but we have something else you should work on. Um, So that was the one thing. And the other thing, as you said, is like it was a bit hard to like find good arguments in terms of numbers, because like usually when you would like work on an external facing product and you have like actual like end customers, it's quite easy now to find numbers regarding accessibility. Like you have like numbers around like how many of your users would like face some disabilities. There are a lot of numbers about like losing out on revenue because you're not making your product accessible to those users. But that isn't the case when you're like building an application that is only used internally by your employees. And at least in the company I was working for that moment, they didn't have any numbers on like how many of the employees would face any disabilities. And also like, unfortunately, we're not quite there yet that like people would feel super comfortable to just like speak openly about this in the environment. So we didn't have any numbers to convince. So that was kind of like the status. And so we tried to like focus really a little bit more on like the whole range of this term of accessibility, because I feel like there's a lot of misconception around it. Like usually the first thing you would think about is like wheelchair users, people who are blind, which is part of it, but it's not all of it. And there's a lot around like these so-called temporary disabilities, which really like everyone could just face for a few weeks, but would still like hinder them to work in the way they used to work. For example, like with office workers, it's often very common that they have some stress injuries in their hands and they cannot use their mouse for a few weeks. So that's kind of like the angle we try to come in and really like telling people, hey, this can happen to you and this will influence the way you work. And we ended up having a presentation with our main stakeholders, talking exactly about that. And in the end, being very honest with them and just said, like, you will face a disability at some point in your life. And we still want to make sure like that you work in an efficient way. And especially with a company that we worked in where like people often stay for really long term, like they have a lot of employees who work there for like, I don't know, 20, 30 years or even more. So they're getting older and they have a lot of these issues with like not seeing that well anymore, or like not being able to target issues so good anymore. So this is all what we talked about, and really trying to make this more understandable to our stakeholders. And to my surprise, that really hit the spot. So after this presentation, we never had a discussion anymore about if we need accessibility or not. They were all really convinced about it, and they really said, okay, we have to do this. This is important. But still, the issue was still there. Like they said, like, okay, but when are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? We are under enormous pressure. We don't have time to stop. So that was like kind of the next challenge.
Yes, because I think for anyone who's not never embarked on this journey, this sounds like this could be a lot of work, and it sounds like it might actually slow down things. How did you handle that tension?
Yeah, so kind of we started into this journey with two premises. We couldn't like stop delivery, and we couldn't just go back and like basically fix accessibility for those part of the product that was already built. And there was a lot of stuff. So that was kind of the basis, which could, I mean, already make you a little bit frustrated, but we just said, okay, let's just go with that. Let's just say that's okay. We're just going to focus on now for like making sure that we can enable teams somehow to build new features with accessibility in mind, so we not create more broken stuff in the end. And that was like the single goal in the beginning. We said, okay, let's not look back, let's not stress about these things. Let's just look forward and let's see what we can do to integrate accessibility in what you're working without stopping you.
I think that sounds really good. Going forward, how much effort is involved if you get started with this? And also, I remember you said 26 teams. So even
Yeah.
if we say just things we do going forward, that's still a lot of people and a lot of complexity and scale to handle. How did you embark on that?
Exactly. So yeah, that That was also a big question because, as you said, 26 different teams from different vendors who worked very differently, were on a lot of time pressure. So we had to make things very simple for them, and we also had to adjust things to the way they're already used to. So we had this like buy-in from the stakeholders. They said, yes, we should like stick to accessibility standards, but that wasn't enough. We couldn't just like tell the teams, yeah, you just have to do that, and then just like expect that something happens, because they were all busy. So the first thing is that what we tried is to really break it down and to make it as simple as it can be, what would be expected. So we tried to create a one-pager with a very simple checklist, basically I think like 14 different like bullet points they could check and say, this is kind of like the standard we're looking for. These are the things that should be true in your product, that it is accessible to our standard. So that was, I think, a really important first step, that we had the spaces like everyone could relate to and everyone would understand what good looks like in our understanding of accessibility. And then we tried to get this into the teams. And I think here was also a bit the challenge that the accessibility capabilities were not necessarily there. Like, as I said, like product teams were already staffed from different vendors. We couldn't just like say, okay, now everyone gets an accessibility expert. We had to work with what was there. So we tried to get a so-called accessibility champion per team. And that was also like a very low level accessibility champion. So basically we just tried to find someone from each team who was like interested in UI development or UX design, had some experience, had like a little bit of interest in learning about that. And then we did a training, like really, really low level, just like 2 hours, and tried to explain to them how they use this checklist that we created, what it means, and what kind of tools and resources they could use to like apply this to their team. But really, instead of like giving them the full expertise, we really tried to give them a toolkit they could build up. And then we said, okay, yeah, just go back to your team and you think about, how could I implement this in my team with what is already there? And I think that was really important, that we said, okay, you don't have to do this one way. We want to find a way that it feels natural to your team to include this. And in the end, it's had very different results in different teams. So, for example, one team was working very heavily with acceptance criteria. They would always check off their stories with like checking through the acceptance criteria, spend some time in crafting them. So it was easy for them to just add points of this checklist in the acceptance criteria. And I think it's not so much more work to actually like develop or design stuff in that way. It's more about that you have to like keep it in mind while you do it. And it's way easier when you like involve it from the start. It costs way less time than when you do it later. And so surprisingly, for most of the teams that worked really well, it was just like giving them a reminder. And that could be acceptance criteria. And another team, it was personas that they used. So they created some personas with disabilities. So they had this kind of in mind, okay, would this feature now work for this persona? And so they found very different ways, but in the end, they all had kind of like the same outcome that led to, okay, we can check off this checklist. I mean, sure, there were always like things that are more complicated where you would need someone with like a lot of accessibility expertise, but these use cases were not that often as we expected. And so kind of like then we just had like a relatively central team with me and a few other people who had more experience, and they could just come back and ask and basically like get their kind of accessibility consultant in the team for the specific problem. And the rest we kind of said like, okay, we trust you, you can solve this yourself.
All right. So there was kind of a small central team at the core driving this or being the go-to experts for further questions. And then each of the teams adapted the approach depending on their context.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
it. Like the central team was not just for accessibility. We did like a few things around UI, UX, but that was kind of like a good foundation for all of these questions around. And also this central team like kind of drove those trainings, like made sure that the accessibility champions are there in each team. For example, when there was a roll off, that we get a successor afterwards. and things like that. And that also, I think, helped the teams to increase confidence in like an area that they work with. Accessibility was not necessarily something they were super familiar with, but they kind of knew, okay, I always have this backup that I can come back to when I don't know anymore what I'm doing here.
Yeah, really fascinating. So if I think about central team and also thinking about how the journey started with getting the buy-in from the, the client stakeholder, it might at first glance look like a top-down approach. A key stakeholder decided, there's a central team that's kind of the go-to group. But I also heard that you actually seem to have taken quite an adaptive bottom-up approach. Can you share a little bit more around that? And so did you start with, I don't know, we do a big kickoff, we invite 26 teams and say, ta-da, now we're doing this? Or was this started on individual one-on-one conversations with those champions that you mentioned? Or maybe you took a completely different approach. How did you approach that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think like in the beginning, it was truly a bit top down, as you said. We had this decision taken and we also shared it that way in like different forms. We said, okay, we've taken this decision. This is kind of what we're striving to. But we also like from the beginning on told the teams we know that this is not something you can just implement. And we like didn't tell them, okay, you have to like get this done until a specific point in time. And this is all what we basically like left up to the teams. We just said, okay, you just take it and you see what you can do with that. So, I mean, I don't know. I still feel like this could have also gone terribly wrong because it was a lot on trust basis and a lot of like getting interest from the people, because we said it's an opportunity to learn. It's an opportunity to like try out and improve what you're doing. And we also like didn't specifically like nominate people. We just said like, okay, if you want to become an accessibility champion, reach out to us. And that really worked in most of teams. Sure, not all. Like some of them we had to push a little bit more, but in a lot of teams there were people that said like, hey, this is a growth opportunity for me. That's like a topic I'm interested in. Also, I think like accessibility is like a really nice topic because most people kind of in the end like it because it's like a positive thing. It's a thing where they feel like, okay, I can influence something, I can do something good. So yeah, that kind of just got like a self-running thing that people like came forward, stepped up, brought their own ideas and shared them back. So in the end, we really had like, I feel like a relatively naturally and organically growing community of accessibility champions or friends that just started to like share their ideas, tell what they did in their teams, also sometimes what didn't work, and then we just like try to work it out together. And I think even though that sounds a bit counterintuitive, like not having like a fixed goal in terms of, okay, we're going to reach this until this date and time really helped.
Yeah, it's a really inspiring story because what at the core for me, what I heard is building in a way a movement that people in those teams started driving forward out of their own motivation because they saw the value in what the accessibility initiative was trying to achieve, and having that build on trust. As would you say that was the key lever or the key ingredient to make that happen? Because creating a movement for something like that can be daunting. Sometimes we think we love to do that. What was the main thing that you think that that enabled that movement to really develop bottom up in the way you've described it?
I think it's mainly also because accessibility is a really easy thing to do. I think it's a really
Okay.
rewarding thing because it's not very complex. And I think that was a very good thing in an environment that was daily working with technical challenges and had a lot of like, these kind of not really satisfactory experiences because they had issues with like performance, with like pulling huge loads of data. And then you have accessibility where it's just like, okay, I have to like use a little bit of HTML structure. I have to think a little bit about like color coding. I have to think of like empathy to people, which is all like kind of, it's not crazy science. And I think that was like a nice experience for most people. Okay, I do a small thing and it changes, and I can check this checklist that we have, and I get a reward in that sense that we've been also
Wow.
like really celebrating, right? The people that like did a good job. So, and I think, especially in an environment like this, where we had a lot of pressure, where we had a lot of frustration, that was just kind of something that kept people going, um, because they were easily successful in the end.
Yeah. And maybe just interesting to highlight, I know that this organization is actually quite a traditional organization that usually works in very different ways, where usually there is more of a top-down approach. Things are quite well planned and structured. So you've managed to kind of bring a different approach, even in an organization that usually has different ways of working. And I think that's also inspiring to see that we can bring those pockets of different ways of working into organizations that might be more traditional.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it has been really nice to see because, as I said, we got the buy-in from the stakeholders, but it was clearly like not top of their priority to list. So I think that's also why we got this freedom to say, okay, we don't have like a fixed deadline for this. But then it really got into the state that people got excited about it and it started to work. And then you could also see that stakeholders got more interested in it and they really started to use it like in presentations to their own leadership and saying like, we're building a product that is accessible. And like that just like sparked again, like it was like constantly like a ping pong thing, like, right, first we had like on a like a low level, a few successes, then like stakeholders and leaders picked this up, which again gave motivation to the teams, like, okay, we're doing something that is recognized. um and it just got something, as I said, in like an environment that didn't have many successes at this point. It just got something very positive people like to speak about.
Yeah, wow. So you really also managed to take it from the team level to the leadership level, and it created a story that people could tell and inspire others with. Um, I want to kind of ask a kind of black and white question further at you. What was and literally my question is, what was like a bright side in this engagement where you were like, whoa, this was a positive surprise, but also maybe like a dark side, something that didn't work, or maybe it was just harder than you expected. What were maybe, yeah, those, the bright and the dark side?
Yeah, I mean, I think I spoke a lot about the bright side. As I said, it surprised myself that like people really picked it up and that like this kind of like trust-based approach really like led to so much, especially in like, I think for accessibility, as I said, it's technically not really complex. So it's a lot about like just having it in mind and knowing that you have to think about it right from the start. And that really kind of just happened at some point that like we had conversations about features, we were talking about completely different stuff, and then suddenly someone just said, yeah, but what about accessibility, is that accessible? And that just like, I think, happened so many times. So it really just like got into the conversation, this whole thing that we talked about so much in the beginning. Okay, how do we make this work? How do we make this a part of daily delivery? That just like happened really naturally at some point. So that was definitely the bright side that still surprises me. I think the dark side of this trust-based approach is always it doesn't work with all teams. Like, I mean, as I said, we have 26 different teams, and for most of them it worked well, but we still have a few black boxes where we like kind of don't really know what's going on. Like, we're kind of like asking from time to time, and they say like, yeah, we didn't look really into it, we don't have the time, and then you're not really sure what to do about it because, yeah, you don't want to change your complete approach and suddenly say like, yeah, but you have to. So that's something, I would say that I still didn't really figure out what do you do with those teams that are not just like picking up on this like natural move that most of the teams just like, I don't know how, just organically got in.
And what were different things that you tried and failed with those teams? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, I'm poking a little bit more at the dark side. We spent so much time to talk about the good things, so I want to sit a little bit there. I don't know if if we'll find an answer, but I'd be curious. You mentioned you nudge them every now and then. Is there other things that you've tried? And
Yeah, we tried a few things then, like with a few teams we really got more explicit then. We basically said, because what was also important for us at some point to get kind of a status where we kind of stand with accessibility, like after they kind of like started to include it in their ways of working, we also started to like hand out teams like kind of like a self audit, so they could really like audit parts of the application or even the whole application if they had time. So we kind of like slowly got an understanding where like the whole product stands in terms of accessibility. And with those teams that we didn't hear anything, we really then like started to say, hey, do we want to schedule like an audit together? Do we want to do this together? um and that kind of worked in that way that we did. But I mean, in the end, it felt like kind of like a lot of wasted time because we did that and then like we had this result and then they didn't react, or it just like kind of like turned into more like, okay, but now we have all these issues, like the negative thing we didn't want to. Then they were just like, okay, how are we going to tackle all these issues because they got in so late? They didn't already like pick up this movement of, okay, it's not that hard, we can like do things on the go. And then basically we had the situation that we just started with like pointing out all the things they did wrong, and then they were just like even more negative about it. So that was definitely not a good thing.
so
um
that's probably a good guardrail for anyone listening. That's an experiment you tried and where you saw that maybe created that negative spiral that you wanted to avoid from the start by going top down, and it probably hardened maybe in that situation the resistance, so that there would need to be some other approach to bring those teams along.
Yeah, and when you say that, like about learnings, I think from one team I also learned, because what we didn't really do in the beginning is we didn't ask much about, because I kind of like, I came in, I had experience with accessibility already. I saw that the product wasn't super accessible, and I kind of like immediately jumped to that conclusion, okay, we don't really have people with a lot of accessibility expertise here. But I think I should have definitely asked first, because for most of the teams that actually turned out to be true, and they were kind of like happy about the trainings. They were happy to learn something new. But actually, in one team, it turned out that there was someone who had a lot of experience and they tried some stuff before and they felt like kind of overrun then with our different approach. And also, I don't know, like that went not very well, but they came back very on a very late point and said like, hey, we have our own way of testing this. Shall I just like throw this away or so? So, like they were really mad. And so I think that would have been way easier when I would have asked in the beginning, like, hey, what are you currently doing for accessibility? Do you have any ways? And then we could have just included that instead of like making someone feel like their approach is not valued.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think actually really great insight, that asking questions and listening to the team might be an approach to move forward. Thank you for sharing. I know going deeper into those dark areas can sometimes be really daunting. And there's one more, not necessarily dark side, but one thing I'm always really passionate about, like linking back with anything that we do in terms of user experience, usability, creating products in general, is thinking back to how does this contribute to the overall business goals and the key buzzword around business value. Um, I know this can be hard to measure because also accessibility is just one part of many pieces of the product. But what were maybe positive but were you able to measure it? And if not, what were maybe positive signals that you saw from users, but maybe also from stakeholders in the business, that this was something that contributed positively to the business, or maybe the other way could also thinking back to the dark side.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't have the chance to have like these really clear measurements where we have really like numbers now to prove that it's good. I mean, we definitely also don't have negative numbers, like what a lot of like stakeholders in bidding expected, that it's like slowing down things. That definitely didn't
Mm.
happen. Like that's relatively clear that like nothing in timelines or so was affected by the things we did.
Okay, so one expectation was if you start doing accessibility, um, uh, software delivery, product delivery will slow down. So in a way, you have data for that actually didn't slow down.
Exactly.
In that situation.
I
So
mean,
nothing changed, which is maybe also a good insight in that situation. You can do accessibility; it will not slow things down. We saw it, we did it, and the speed was the same.
yeah, you can put it like that. I mean, that's the measurement. You're right. In the end, yeah, that's true. Like there was still like, I mean, there was still delays in the timeline, but we could like lead this pretty sure to like other things. We were pretty clear that this wasn't like anything related to the accessibility work we did.
Yeah.
So that's a measurement. On the other hand, I mean, we definitely saw some signals, I would say, that were at the point where I was still in the project, I think still like in the making, and maybe we can measure them one day, hopefully, which is in general, we saw that we're getting a better quality in terms of like UI code. So for example, like the testing coverage was way better because like in the way you like write code in an accessible way, it has a lot to do with like good HTML structure, roles and stuff. So like it was easier to write tests for that, and like the test coverage like seemed to increase. We had a few findings that were actually like kind of like related to other things, but they kind of got started because someone was trying to make something accessible, and then they found a test that was not working that led to something else that we found then that was good, that we found this at this point. So stuff like this in the code that was really nice to see. And in general, we also had clear signals that like in usability testings we felt like that in general, like those things that we like develop with accessibility in mind seem to like be more understandable for all users and seem to have like better results. But as I said, we don't have like clear comparisons at this, but this is all the things we like kind of perceived that in general, like also like the considerations we took, like when looking at the design of features with like accessibility in mind, it also helped us to like in general talk more about the user, because it's just a consideration of the user. And when you start talking about like, hey, is this accessible, you talk about the user, which was also not always the case in this organization. So that kind of was also an excuse to think about usability in general.
Ah, nice. And maybe if I can add one thing that I just heard from when you shared some of the bright spots earlier was there seemed to also be a positive impact, and that's just a signal from what I heard around employee engagement in the sense of our development teams creating the software. There seemed to be this positive driver, a positive vision, making a difference beyond maybe just building things, if I may simplify it. But that's something that I heard when you shared the story, that some really picked it up and it seemed to make a difference in how they look at their work and the impact that they're making. So beyond the product itself that's getting improved, I think that's a really interesting aspect to also consider. Would you agree, or did I maybe mishear from what you shared?
I would 100% agree. I mean, I may be a little bit biased because I'm so passionate about this topic, but this is general. A feeling I have a lot. Now I'm in a different project. Currently, I'm talking about the same stuff about accessibility, and I feel like that's really something that is motivating people and give them a purpose, because sometimes um, like a lot of people working in development teams are really detached from the end product. So sometimes it's really hard to understand how you create value, and accessibility. As I said, it's such an easy thing to see the value in it because it's about people. It's about like making something accessible to everyone, not like excluding people. So I think it's just very positive for people, and it gives them back a purpose when they say, okay, I worked today on something that was clearly good for other people. So I feel in general, it's like always a very positive topic wherever you go. Just people are very motivated and like go out with smiles of the training. I mean, it's like a bright world, but in the end, it's like that. You know, like you're working in software development, you're dealing with bugs, with long timelines, and then you just talk about accessibility, you talk about a topic that you feel, okay, I can make an impact. And that's usually, in my experience, just like very rewarding for most people.
Yes. So we might have listeners now who say, amazing, I'm sold. I want to do this in my organization. What would be your recommendation, Larissa? Where should people start? How can one start? It still feels like a Herculean task. What are maybe a few tips as the first steps that someone can take who just starts on the journey? And maybe also if someone's already started on that journey, what are maybe a few things or a few principles that have made you successful in driving this within that complex environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first question you should always ask yourself is like, where do I currently stand in my journey? And what would be the next step according from my basis? So, and something that can help you with that is something my colleague Minette and me developed. This is called the Digital Accessibility Maturity Model. We're not the only ones that did something like that, but we did this based on our experience from the project I just told you about. It's basically like a 4-stage model where you can check where is your organization in terms of maturity for accessibility. And it really starts with the basic, like, do I even know? Or does my organization even know, like, what does it mean to have like an accessible product? Do we have a clear goal defined? Which could be, for example, like as this checklist that we created in my project, where we clearly know, okay, when you do this 14 things, then you are accessible. It could be something else, but you need to know so you can also communicate this. And you have to have a baseline as an organization everyone understands. And then you just go from there, and then you can see, like, is this like the beginning stage? Do I really have to start with that? Or are we further? Then we can think about, okay, we need more people to train. And then I think it's all about going this journey, which always should be, I think, the end goal, to have accessibility naturally included in the way your teams work. It should not be something on top at the end, because this will always create more work, more effort, more frustration. But basically, at the moment you say, okay, the feature is done, you should also be confident it's accessible, because that should be all included. Yeah, and I think with this model, you can really like check where you stand. We have a few recommendations on what you can do then. So I would recommend this as a good start, and then you just see where you go from there.
And do I need to be an expert to use this model? What if if I have no experience and I'm just listening to this and think, wow, this is really important. Um, will I be able to find my first steps with this?
I think so, yes. You definitely don't have to be an accessibility expert. I think when you worked in some kind of team or company, I think it's also very applicable to other things. Like there are a lot of maturity models for other things. So it's just about like understanding what's your, like your fluency in your organization, um, how many people know about this topic, how many people work with this topic. So you definitely don't have to be an expert.
To get started. Wonderful. And what are maybe some principles that helped you to be successful in implementing this topic at scale?
Yeah, I think it's really about relaxing a bit and accepting that you cannot fix everything from the beginning. Like, I think the typical thing that you would read in a lot of articles about like making your organization accessible is that you start with this big audit of everything. And I totally agree that this is good because you understand where you are. But when you just have like this long, long list of things to fix, that, yeah, I mean, that can be like, I don't know, it's very frustrating, very intimidating. And usually you wouldn't like be able to like just stop everything else and do that. So I think it's very good to just say, okay, let's just focus on like making sure the next thing we build is better in terms of accessibility. Might not be perfect, but we can think about, okay, we can adapt our ways of working here. We can adapt how we design. We can adapt how we code for the next feature that we include accessibility. And then you do this a few times and you will naturally become more confident. And then when you look back at the issues you created, this will all be way less intimidating because you understand what's going on. You can like way better estimate how much effort this is. And then you can pick those issues from time to time and really go slow with fixing those. So, at least in my experience, I feel like that's a way better way to go than just like throwing a bunch of accessibility issues at a team and say, okay, you have to fix them all now. And mostly they won't even like really understand what they are about and even less understand how they would fix it. And even when they fix it, they will do the same mistakes again when they don't really understand what this is about.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, looking at where are we today, and then what's the first step that we can take to make a difference. Not worrying about the gap of everything, because that can be daunting. I totally agree. But just looking like what's the next best step that we can take to make a difference. And also from the story you shared, that also is a way to get quick positive feedback by taking those small steps and really having that as fuel to that movement that you created. Super, super fascinating, Larissa, all the things that you've shared. We are talking today about creating better products. And before we go, my wrap up question to you is, why is accessibility important for creating better products?
Yeah, I think it's because in the end, you think about your users. It's just a part of like the people that will use your products. And in the end, you cannot exclude them. First of all, it's a huge part of your users, as we talked about, because there are like so many different forms of disabilities that are included under this wide umbrella of accessibility. And second of all, there's also so much proof that in the end, like building something in a way that is accessible to all makes the product also better for all. Like there are so many examples out there where something was created because of a specific disability that we're now using in a lot of different scenarios. Like for example, subtitles originally for like the deaf community is something that I use every day even though I can hear, or like electric toothbrushes. There are so many examples of this. So in the end, you will definitely like create a better product because you're innovative and you think about like a range of different people that would use your product in different ways.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Larissa. It's been really inspiring talking to you. I wanted to ask you about some recommendations for our listeners in terms of books, articles, podcasts, newsletters, anything that inspire you. Could be on accessibility or anything else that just resonates with you. What are maybe 3 things that you would recommend?
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Let's maybe start with one about accessibility, as we've been talking about. I think, like, especially when we talked about someone who might be interested in this topic but is not an expert, like a book I would really recommend and which also helped me to get into the topic is Accessibility for Everyone by Laura Kalbeck. She like describes this just very, very well, what this is about and like the basics. So I think that's a very nice, easy read for getting into the topic. Definitely recommend it. And then like going away from accessibility, like my absolute favorite book, and I know this sounds cheesy, but a little bit life-changing book I read last year is Atomic Habits. Um, I don't remember the author now at the moment.
I read it too, and it's amazing. I also forgot the author, but we'll include the link to the book in the show notes. So Atomic Habits, truly inspiring. I totally agree. And what's your third recommendation?
My third recommendation is podcast, and it's like I mean, it's not like a specific podcast, might not be like the super secret tip, but there's a podcast series on Spotify that is called TED Talks Daily. And you get like a random TED Talk every day. And I'm just really randomly listening to it. And there's so much interesting stuff that I feel is also sometimes completely out of my kind of like business circle, out of my topics of expertise. Yesterday I heard a podcast about like how much water you should drink, and it's just really inspiring. Even though when you're not interested in a topic, you can learn a lot about how to make a good talk.
Super. Wonderful, Larissa. Thank you so much for joining us. Maybe as a last question, if people would love to connect to you and ask you questions or share their experience, where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I think that's the best place to find me. Just type my name, Larissa Günther, and you will find me for sure.
Super. Thank you so much, Larissa. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for sharing your experience. I really learned a lot, especially around creating a movement by starting with trust. I think that's truly inspiring. So thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Now a question to our listeners. I'm really curious, what is your experience with implementing accessibility in your organization? Have you been able to do this at scale? Did you start with a small movement? What were the successes and setbacks for you in your context? Because they'll always be different. And I would love to hear about your experience. Please share it in the comments or reach out directly to myself. I would love to hear about it and maybe have you as a guest on the show in future soon. And finally, if you did love this episode as much as I do, then please share it with your network and give us a like in your favorite streaming platform. And thanks for joining us and see you next time.